I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The morning began like any other. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of a news anchor on the kitchen TV. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, a faint smile playing on her lips. I watched her from the doorway, trying to pinpoint what had changed. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves, and her soft blue eyes seemed distracted, distant even. But the woman I married had mastered the art of appearing composed. "Big day at work?" I asked, masking the unease bubbling beneath my words. She glanced up briefly. "Just meetings. You know how it is." I nodded, though I didn't know anymore. Sarah had always been ambitious, driven, and sharp. That's part of what drew me to her in the first place. Over the years, she'd built a career as a respected corporate lawyer, her days filled with high-profile cases and long hours. But lately, her late nights and work trips had begun to feel more personal than professional. The clues were subtle at first: a forgotten receipt for a bottle of wine I hadn't shared with her, a sudden surge in interest in yoga classes taught by someone named Greg, and the way her phone was always glued to her side, even when she was home. But it wasn't just those things. It was the emotional distance, the moments where her gaze seemed to drift far away, as if she were somewhere else entirely. My mind flashed back to the night it began to unravel. It was 2 months ago. We'd been sitting on the couch, her scrolling through her phone while I worked on a presentation for my firm. A message had come in, lighting up her screen. For the briefest second, I saw the name, Greg, Yoga. She quickly turned the screen face down and continued scrolling, her face an unreadable mask. At the time, I brushed it off. Yoga instructors text their clients, right? Maybe he was sending her an update about a class. But the seed of doubt was planted, and over the weeks, it grew. I remember the first time I truly followed that feeling. It was a Friday night. Sarah had told me she was working late on a big case. I called her office around 9 p.m., hoping to surprise her with dinner. Her assistant sounded confused. "Oh, Sarah left hours ago. She said she had personal plans." When she came home that night, smelling faintly of wine and a cologne I didn't recognize, I didn't confront her. Instead, I started paying closer attention. I began small. Her phone sat on the counter one morning while she showered. I wasn't proud of myself as I picked it up, my fingers hovering over the lock screen. The password was a 4-digit code I'd seen her use dozens of times. It worked. Her messages were mundane at first, chats with colleagues, reminders for appointments. But then I found a thread labeled, Greg, Yoga. My stomach tightened as I read through their texts. They weren't explicit, but they were far from innocent. There were jokes, compliments, and plans for drinks the following weekend. That's when I knew. Sarah wasn't just distracted, she was gone. A part of her heart was invested elsewhere, leaving me to wonder when, or if, I'd ever had it in the first place. Still, I didn't confront her immediately. I needed more. I started checking her credit card statements. Charges at restaurants we'd never visited, purchases for hotels in cities she claimed were for conferences. Each discovery felt like a punch to the gut, but it also fueled my determination. If she was going to tear apart our marriage, she wasn't going to do it on a foundation of lies. Now, as I stood in the kitchen, watching her scroll through her phone, I felt the weight of everything I'd discovered. The evidence I had wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. But confrontation wouldn't be enough. I needed a plan, something that would remind her, and Greg, of the vows she so easily cast aside. "Dinner tonight?" I asked, breaking the silence. Her fingers paused, mid-scroll. "I might have to stay late again. It's been a crazy week." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Let me know if that changes." As she left for work, I sat at the table, sipping my coffee and staring at the spot where her phone had been. My mind was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, but above all, clarity. I knew what I had to do. And it started with patience. Patience, after all, was something Sarah had never expected from me. The silence of the house was deafening. Sarah was gone for the day, and I found myself alone, the lingering tension of our morning exchange pressing down on me. The air seemed thicker somehow, weighted by the knowledge of her betrayal. I stared at my untouched cup of coffee, the faint steam curling into the air, and tried to suppress the rising tide of anger that had taken root in my chest. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. It would be too easy for her to spin the truth, to deny and dismiss. I needed irrefutable proof. The kind of evidence she couldn't explain away with half-hearted excuses about work stress or misunderstanding text messages. If I was going to confront her, it had to be airtight. I began with her laptop. Sarah often worked from home, and her laptop was always lying around. That day was no different. It sat on the dining room table, its sleek surface gleaming under the morning light. She rarely locked it, she trusted me, just as I had once trusted her. The laptop powered on with a simple press of a button. Her desktop was organized, folders neatly labeled, work, personal, taxes. It all seemed innocent enough, but I knew better. I clicked on the email icon and waited as her inbox loaded. The familiar pang of guilt gnawed at me. Invading someone's privacy, especially someone you once loved unconditionally, was not an easy task. But betrayal changes things. It hardens you. Her inbox was, at first glance, mundane. Work emails filled the screen, with subject lines about meetings, deadlines, and client concerns. But as I scrolled further, I began to notice a pattern. There were a few emails from someone named Greg. They weren't overly frequent, but they stood out because of their tone. They were informal, playful, and hinted at a familiarity that went beyond professional boundaries. One email, in particular, caught my attention. It was from a month ago, during one of her supposed work trips. The subject line read, "Can't wait to see you." My heart pounded as I clicked it open. Sarah. Looking forward to this weekend. Let's make it one to remember. Gee. The simplicity of it enraged me. It wasn't graphic or explicit, but the intent was clear. I checked the timestamp. It coincided perfectly with her trip to Chicago, a trip she had described as grueling and uneventful. The memory of her exhausted sighs and exaggerated complaints about long meetings came flooding back, now tainted with the knowledge that they were likely lies. I scrolled through more emails, but nothing else stood out. If they were communicating about their affair, they were doing it through another channel. I closed the laptop and leaned back, my mind racing. Her phone. That's where the real answers would be. Sarah's phone was always with her, but I remembered the night I had first unlocked it. The memory of their text thread replayed in my mind, the vague flirtations and hints of intimacy. I hadn't delved deeper then, but now I needed to. If I could just get my hands on her phone again. I started formulating a plan. Sarah often left her phone unattended when she showered or cooked. Those were my windows of opportunity. But I needed to be careful. If she suspected anything, she might lock it down, making it impossible for me to access. That evening, Sarah returned home later than usual. She breezed through the door with a tired smile, her briefcase slung over one shoulder. "Long day," she muttered, setting her things down and heading straight for the kitchen. I followed her, watching as she rummaged through the fridge for a quick snack. "Want me to make you something?" I offered, keeping my tone light. She waved me off. "No, I'm fine. Just grabbing a yogurt." I noticed her phone on the counter, charging. My pulse quickened. If she left it there, I could use the opportunity. But as if sensing my thoughts, she picked it up and carried it with her to the living room. We ate dinner in relative silence. Sarah scrolled through her phone while I pretended to read a book. Every now and then, she chuckled softly, her attention focused entirely on the glowing screen. My chest tightened. Was it Greg? Was she texting him right now, with me sitting just a few feet away? After dinner, she announced she was going to take a shower. My moment had arrived. As soon as the water began running, I moved to the counter where she'd left her phone. This time, she hadn't locked it. Maybe she was getting careless, or maybe she trusted me not to look. Either way, I seized the opportunity. I scrolled quickly through her messages, my fingers trembling. The thread with Greg was near the top. The most recent messages were from earlier that day. Greg, Friday can't come soon enough. Sarah, same here. I can't wait to see you. This time, let's try that new wine bar you mentioned. It felt like a punch to the gut. Friday was 2 days away. She wasn't even bothering to hide her plans anymore. I quickly took screenshots of the messages and sent them to myself before putting her phone back where I found it. My heart was racing as I heard the shower turn off. I hurried back to the couch, pretending to scroll through my own phone. She emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, a towel wrapped around her shoulders. She smiled at me, completely unaware of what I had just discovered. That night, as Sarah slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of anger and resolve. The evidence was mounting. I had her emails, her texts, her lies. But this wasn't just about catching her, it was about justice, about making sure she understood the magnitude of her betrayal. And so, the plan began to take shape. The following day, I sat in my office, the evidence I had collected laid out on my laptop like pieces of a puzzle. Each screenshot, email, and receipt told a story Sarah had tried to bury beneath layers of routine and affection. Yet the more I stared at it, the more it screamed betrayal. It wasn't enough to catch her, I needed to show her the depth of her deception and the cost of her choices. Justice wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about reclaiming my dignity. I spent the morning preparing for what would come next. I contacted an attorney, ensuring I had legal footing should the confrontation escalate into divorce. I wanted to keep the house, the financial stability I'd worked so hard to build, and most importantly, my self-respect. My attorney assured me that with the evidence I had, I was in a strong position. "You've done your homework," he said, his tone laced with approval. "This isn't going to be easy, but you're in control. Remember that." His words echoed in my head as I left his office. Control. That's what I needed. The betrayal had taken away my sense of power, but now I was taking it back. And it started with Friday night. Friday arrived, and Sarah was in unusually high spirits. She hummed as she got ready, selecting a sleek black dress and applying her makeup with meticulous care. I watched her from the doorway, my chest tight with a mix of anger and sadness. The woman I had loved for so many years was slipping away, lost in a web of lies she had woven herself. "Big night?" I asked casually. She hesitated, just for a moment, before flashing me a smile. "Work dinner. Some partners are in town. You know how it is." I nodded, feigning ignorance. "Have fun." She leaned in to kiss my cheek, but I turned away under the pretense of checking my watch. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Moments later, she was out the door, her heels clicking against the pavement. I waited until I was sure she was gone before springing into action. Using the GPS tracker I'd installed on her phone earlier in the week, I confirmed her location. As expected, she wasn't heading to a restaurant or hotel associated with her work. Instead, the signal led to a boutique wine bar downtown, a spot she had mentioned in her texts with Greg. Grabbing my car keys, I followed the GPS trail. The wine bar was nestled in a trendy part of the city, dimly lit and buzzing with conversation. Through the large windows, I spotted Sarah almost immediately. She was seated at a corner table with Greg, her body language open and relaxed. They laughed over glasses of wine, their heads close together in a way that made my stomach churn. I stayed outside, taking a few discreet photos with my phone. My hands trembled, but I steadied myself. This wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about showing her the consequences of her actions. After taking what I needed, I retreated to my car, heart pounding. My next stop was Greg's wife's house. Greg's wife, Elena, had been a name in Sarah's emails, a fleeting mention in conversations where Greg tried to downplay the risks of their affair. But I had tracked her down, finding her address through public records and social media. When I knocked on her door, I half expected her not to answer. But she did. Elena was petite, with sharp green eyes that narrowed in confusion as she opened the door. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to drop in like this," I began, holding up my phone. "But I think you need to see this." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the phone. When she finally nodded, I handed it over, showing her the photos I had just taken. Her face paled as she scrolled through the images, her hand flying to her mouth. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Greg, he wouldn't." "I wish it wasn't real," I said softly. "But it is. I've been piecing this together for weeks. I thought you deserved to know." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, anger replacing shock. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm. "I'll handle this." I nodded, relieved to have an ally in what was quickly becoming a war. When I returned home, Sarah was already there. She sat on the couch, her shoes kicked off, and a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You're home late," she remarked, her tone neutral. "Had a lot to do," I replied, my voice even. "How was dinner?" "It was fine," she said, looking away. "Uneventful." I nodded, biting back the urge to confront her right then and there. The confrontation would come, but on my terms. Tonight, I would let her believe everything was normal, let her feel the weight of her choices in the silence that followed. As I lay in bed that night, listening to her breathing beside me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were falling into place. Tomorrow, I would put the plan into action. Tomorrow, Sarah would see the full extent of what she had done. The next morning dawned cool and crisp, sunlight streaming through the blinds as if mocking the storm brewing inside me. Sarah moved around the house with ease, humming softly to herself as though nothing was amiss. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back, looking every bit the woman I had once adored. It was hard to reconcile this image with the one from last night, the woman leaning into Greg, her laughter filling a room I didn't belong to. Today was the day. My resolve was steely, my plan set. But there was one twist Sarah wouldn't see coming. As she poured herself coffee, I approached her. "We need to talk," I said, my tone neutral. She looked up, startled by the directness. "Is everything okay?" I gestured toward the living room. "Sit." She hesitated but obeyed, settling into the armchair while I took the couch opposite her. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on the room. I reached into the drawer of the coffee table and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with the evidence I'd collected. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. I slid the envelope across the table. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she untied the string and pulled out the contents, screenshots of texts with Greg, photos of them at the wine bar, and copies of her credit card statements showing the hotel charges. Her face paled, and she dropped the papers as though they burned her. "I can explain," she began, her voice shaking. I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. This isn't about explanations. This is about accountability." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "It was a mistake. I was confused, lonely. It didn't mean anything." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean anything? Sarah, you planned entire weekends with him. You lied to me, over and over. You built an entire second life. Tears streamed down her face. Please, just. I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. Stop, I interrupted. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together. And it wasn't just me who noticed. I pulled out my phone and opened a video. The screen lit up with a recording of Greg and Sarah at the wine bar, their intimacy undeniable. But it wasn't just that. The video transitioned to Elena, standing at her door, holding the same evidence I'd shown her. Her voice came through the phone loud and clear, "I'll handle this." Sarah's face crumpled as she recognized the setting. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I told the truth," I said simply. "I told Greg's wife. She deserved to know, just like I did." Suddenly, her expression shifted, fear replaced by anger. "You had no right to interfere in his life." "No right?" I repeated, incredulous. "You destroyed his life just as much as ours. If there's fallout, that's on both of you." She rose to her feet, her tears replaced by defiance. "You're no saint, Mark. You work late, bury yourself in projects, and forget I exist half the time. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, I wouldn't have needed someone else." I stood, my own anger boiling over. "You think that justifies this? That justifies sneaking around, lying, and betraying everything we had?" Her eyes burned with fury, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her coat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Hours passed. The house was quiet, the weight of the confrontation settling over me like a thick fog. I had expected her anger, her tears, even her deflections. What I hadn't expected was what came next. The door creaked open just after sunset. I turned, expecting to see Sarah, but it wasn't her. Instead, it was Elena. Her expression was unreadable as she stepped inside, holding a single piece of paper. "What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. She held up the paper. "This was sent to my house today. I think you should see it." I took the paper from her and read it. My blood ran cold. It was an unsigned letter, written in a scrawl I didn't recognize. "You're not as innocent as you think, Mark. Did Sarah ever tell you how we met? How we really met? Ask her about that night at the lake house. Ask her about her first love. You're not her first betrayal, you're just the longest one." I looked up at Elena, stunned. "What is this?" She shrugged, her face tight. "I have no idea. But it changes things, doesn't it?" I couldn't respond. My mind reeled, replaying years of memories, trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle. Could it be true? Had Sarah been lying to me from the very beginning? Elena sighed and turned to leave. "I thought you should know. Good luck, Mark." As the door closed behind her, I sat down, the letter clutched in my trembling hands. Sarah's betrayal had been devastating, but this was something else entirely. The foundation of my life, my marriage, and even my sense of self felt as though it was crumbling beneath me. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke my trance. Moments later, Sarah walked in, her eyes red but her expression calm. She stopped short when she saw the letter in my hand. "What's that?" she asked, her voice wary. I held it up. "You tell me." Her face paled, her composure slipping for the second time that day. She opened her mouth as if to speak but closed it again, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging between us. And for the first time, I realized that the story I thought I had uncovered was only the beginning of something much darker.